Okay. We are now officially and live streaming on Facebook. So for those of you who are joining us on the Nevada PTA Facebook page, welcome. Tonight we are having a virtual town hall regarding bias, racism, and trauma with the discussion around supporting students and engaging families. My name is Rebecca Garcia, and I am the president for the Nevada Parent Teachers Association. Joining me tonight as a co-moderator is one of our advocacy team members, Kali Fox Miller. So welcome, Kali. Thank you for joining me tonight. And on our panel tonight, we'll start first with Dr. Tanya Holmes-Sutton. Dr. Holmes-Sutton is a national board certified teacher, a veteran educator of more than 20 years. She is a founder and program director for the Nevada National Board Professional Learning Institute and the state director for Teach Plus Nevada. She has served as the governor appointed member on the Nevada State Board of Education and the West Ed Board of Directors. She is a board of director for the National Board of Professional Teaching Standards, a board trustee for the National Teachers Hall of Fame, and currently she is a member of the Nevada State Public Charter School Authority. But really her claim to fame is that she taught my kids. And really it's all those other things first. But in our family, we love her as my kid's very first educator. So welcome, Tanya, and thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you very much.
Next, I would like to introduce Monique McCoy. Monique is a licensed social worker and a certified clinical trauma professional. And she's also a doctoral student pursuing a PhD in social work. Currently, she works as a school social worker in Clark County School District. She is also worked as a school social worker in Arizona and served as a family therapist. She's also been a member of the local NAACP Executive Board since 2013. Welcome, Monique. Thank you for being with us tonight.
Thank you for having me.
And finally, we have Juliana Urtubey, also a national board certified teacher. She is a hybrid teacher and learning strategist here in Las Vegas. She is an Understood Teacher Fellow, a National Board of Professional Teaching Standards Teacher Fellow, and a Teach Plus Nevada Fellow. She left this out of her resume, but I decided to add it back in, that she is also a Rogers Foundation Heart of Education Award winner in 2018. Congratulations for that. And the recent recipient of the CPLC Esperanza Latina Teaching Award. So welcome, Juliana, and thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you for having me here.
And thank you for joining us in this new virtual world that we're all getting really used to, right? It seems like if nothing else, at the end of this pandemic, we should have all mastered these virtual events. But we also appreciate everybody joining us via technology and hope that all the technology works in our favor tonight for a really good discussion. Kali?
All right, so we wanted to start tonight with some definitions, but before I get to the definitions, I also wanted to talk about correction. I think I'm very lucky that in my life I have been told that correction is a form of flattery. So if at any time, ladies, we are using words or terms that are outdated, please feel free to correct us. If we are asking the question in the wrong way or an offensive way, please also feel free to correct us. We welcome your input in every level, because what we're trying to do here is not only just help our community, but help ourselves to further the conversation. So we consulted the Anti-Defamation League in their elementary curriculum, and they provide the following definitions for racism and bias. Bias is a preference, either for or against an individual or group, that affects fair judgment. And racism is a prejudice and or discrimination against people because of their racial group.
Obviously, we're like many events happening around the country right now in response to current events. The death of George Floyd, the protests that have continued after, have raised so many issues for people of all backgrounds. And you see those conversations happening in the streets, and you see them on social media and with family and friends, and there's so many layers and so many challenges, but also an opportunity for us to move the conversation forward of how can we be aware and recognize how to better support students and families. And so we wanted to start with Monique as a, oh, I'm jumping ahead. I stole one of Khalil's questions, so I'm gonna go with it and then we'll adapt. Wanted to start kind of addressing that really in our face situation right now, that violence is dominating the news. From the murder of George Floyd to the protests, we see it. And whether parents think that kids aren't aware of it or not, it's, you know, it's on television, it's on YouTube, those things are there. So regardless of age, kids are being exposed to trauma and violence. And so how, you know, your background is in social work, how can parents, many of us who are struggling themselves to figure it out, help children process what they're seeing and manage their feelings around these violent events?
The answer to that is twofold. In social work, and I think in most of the mental health community, we usually use a plane as an analogy, right? When the plane is about to crash, they say, secure your mask first before you put it on other people. And so I think the first part of that is, as parents, we are still allowed to be human. And some of these things that we are witnessing are highly traumatizing for us, right? So I think it's important to remember that you have to practice your own self-care and your own coping mechanisms and self-regulation. And then from there, you can be able to address your children in an age-appropriate way. And the good news is you're not alone. Recently, Sesame Street put out a really good program that is still available online to watch about age-appropriate racism and how to have those conversations with your kids. In addition to that, PBS also put one out last week. So you don't have to do all the work yourself. There is help. But most importantly, it's one of those issues that you can't ignore. As you said earlier, our kids pick up on more than we can imagine. And so avoiding the conversation isn't going to deter them from asking about it. And I would rather them ask you, being somebody as a trusted adult, than to maybe go ask some of their friends and people who may not be as well informed on what to say and how to protect them.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
All right, so since Rebecca stole my question, I will steal hers next. This question is for Juliana. And we wanted to talk about equity, access, and opportunity gaps that are critical issues in education. Why is it important to recognize the systematic and structural nature of racism in order to be able to address these issues in education?
I got the big question. Well, I think that's a question that we're always going to have to keep asking ourselves. Partially because inequity reveals itself both in a micro and a macro scale. So we have to understand why certain systems were built. And I think that when we look at systems holistically, public systems holistically, housing, healthcare, the police, education, we have to understand the history of those programs. And so history of education is really where the answers lie. When we look at the housing and how a lot of the schools receive a lot of their monies from property taxes, then we dive into more segregation in terms of housing and access. And we could follow all those rules, all those laws that have passed that have discriminated against and made access more difficult. But in terms of looking at our families, looking at our schools, I think the most important thing is always to be really reflective. Who's around us? Who has the most access? Who doesn't have certain access? I always try to look at it like that. When we talk about kids and families, I try to stay away from terms like socioeconomic or low socioeconomic, and I try to really base it on access, families with low access. And that can be linguistic access, that can be economic access, that could be educational access. But you know, I've been really privileged to have mentors and studied under people who really value the funds of knowledge that people have. Louis Moll's work really taught me to look at all of the things that every family brings forward, and start from there, because all the communities, even communities that are hurting, even communities that have low access, have tremendous assets. And I think that that's where we really start in terms of thinking of our power and thinking of how we're going to confront directly systematic and systemic issues, but how we're also going to build and bring our kids forward and give our kids hope and celebrate, like Dr. Bettina Joey says, or Dr. Bettina Love says, celebrate the joy, you know, along with the violence that we see, which, you know, I think is dignified, the rage and the hurt and all those emotions. I think they're dignified, they're rightful. And so not fearing away from our emotions or fearing away from these really big issues that we have, but instead saying, okay, these are the strengths that this is the joy that we have. This is the power of our children. Kids have an amazing ability to connect. They have an amazing ability to be resilient towards things, and to really be equity and equality driven. They know what's fair. And I think that really moving forward with those strengths is where we come in terms of being creative and how we can curve some of those implications.
You know, as you were talking, one of the things that came to mind is kind of that idea of assumptions, you know, that we make so many assumptions based on everything from, you know, physical, economic, language. We assume that certain people fit certain categories or have certain advantages or disadvantages. And I think actually Nevada is a great place to recognize that that's not always correct. Like but it's sometimes hard for those of us who bring our own bias, our own experience to the conversation to recognize that what we are seeing is rooted in our assumption versus what may be reality. I also really thought one of the things that I came to is that concept of seeing people as human, rather, you know, that whole perspective on that. And I wanted to kind of loop back to one of that first question and add a little bit onto it. And maybe Dr. Holmes-Sutton, if you could answer this or start with it, and anybody else can chime in addition to what we talked about already, how do you think parents can, and educators, because I think we're team, you know, kids learn from home and school. So I always like to look at that together, but how do you think we can address those issues of bias, understanding what bias is, and racism in age appropriate ways?
Reflecting on the question, I would go back to what Monique shared around first acknowledging one's own biases, calling out those that may be subconscious, unconscious, if you will, by asking yourself why you make the choices that you make, and then in acknowledging that the children's concerns are real, that they need to be addressed, and that it is important to have honest conversations with them. I will acknowledge as an early childhood teacher that children know far more than we give them credit for.
Yeah.
They see and hear everything that they don't. And even if they aren't being exposed to the news intentionally, they're overhearing conversations. They're overhearing the conversations that adults are having, and adults are having conversations everywhere, whether that's in line at a grocery store, at a park, if children are now out and about, and definitely within our homes as we are reacting to what is happening across the country and honestly around the world, as this is having incredible impact. I'd like to take a moment and and give context to the fact that all children are reacting, even toddlers. I have a 3-year-old nephew, and it is breaking my heart. So I pray not to be emotional, and I ask you for grace. He's been asking me, am I going to jail? That's heavy. Like, where is a 3-year-old thinking that they're going to jail, and why would they think that that would be a consequence for any choices that they have made? And so I think it's important to reassure children that we are here for them, that we intend to protect them, that we intend to protect them from all harm, that they are in fact safe, that they are loved, that they are cared for, that they have value. And more than that, more than words, I think it's important to touch children, hold children, bring children close. Certainly, I'm also acknowledging as a teacher, what are my boundaries for that, but also acknowledging that everyone needs to have some physical touch. And with that being said, I took my nephew into my arms, I held him, I rocked him, and I told him, I love you. And Nani is always going to protect you, and you are not going to jail. Police are people who are here to protect us and to take care of us. And sometimes things happen, people do things they shouldn't do, but that's for adults to take care of, that you don't have to be worried about that. We also should acknowledge that worries are not adults' worries. So what we are worried about are not the things that children are concerned about. They're also concerned about our well-being. Are we going away? Because once I had told him that he wasn't going to jail, he asked me, anyone going to jail, right? Are you going to jail? Is Pop going to jail? Like, no one is going to jail. We're going to be here with you. We're here to love you, to care for you. And then he made me pinky promise. My eyes go big, free, and I'm like, okay, leaning all in. I pinky promise that you are not going to jail. I pinky promise that we are not going to jail, that you are going to be safe. You're going to be okay. I think that certainly if we are uncertain about how to have conversations with children, that we reach out to others for resources, to know that all of those resources don't necessarily have to cost us, and that we can find comfort and support in one another and in our network. But you all have really given me something to think about. As if I don't have enough things to do, Danny and I, my daughter, have really considered now, perhaps we should be having a group for children. Perhaps we should be helping children to breathe and to pause and to be able to discuss their feelings in a safe way, and perhaps help families be able to do that as well. Again, going back to how do we talk to them in an appropriate way, we have conversations that are truthful. We have conversations about feelings. We have conversations in which we ensure that we are doing everything that we can to let our children know that it's okay to feel what you feel, and that we are there for them to help them to be able to call out, identify, and own those feelings, and then be able to work through them.
Well, so much of it goes back to the relationships, right, that we have with each other, and the value that we place on our family, our friends. I also think too, do you think, and this is kind of a thrown in question for the group, but like, do you think that all of the events are even more challenging to process because they've been added on to this extended isolation caused by the pandemic? They were already feeling isolated, and now we have heavy conversations about justice and injustice and race and trauma added to that. Do you think that there's an intersection there that we need to recognize, that kind of we're already bringing 8 weeks, or not, however many weeks we are, I don't know how many weeks we are even, I don't know what day it is, you know, how does that, you know, maybe Monique, you could hit that, like, how do you think, do you think that there is an interplay with the reality that we've all been dealing with a pandemic on top of all of these issues being in the forefront again?
Personally, I think that us being home with this pandemic has increased our exposure to the news, our exposure to media, social media. And so the information is traveling a lot faster, and people are exposed to things a lot faster. But as an African-American community, this is not new.
Yeah.
Right. So these injustices and these feelings and this trauma have been going on for centuries, and people have endured, and people have played roles and been silent on a lot of things that are very upsetting. And unfortunately, the death of George Floyd and watching that really triggered a lot of things in a lot of people. And it was almost just like the last straw. It became enough is enough. We're tired. We're fed up, and we have to do something now. And so I don't know if the pandemic heightened the emotions rather than just spread the information a lot quicker than maybe if we were all working and out and about and things like that.
Yeah. And I think that one of the things you said that I had meant to mention earlier is too that I appreciate you bringing this up. I think it's important for everyone, regardless of what your awareness is about racism in America, to recognize that George Floyd is not the reason. It is a part of a decades and centuries of injustice that, like you said, boiled up because of it. And I think that's something that sometimes, especially seeing even people in my own social media thread, you know, they think it's about one event, when really the issues, like you said, it's compounded, and that's just what's coming up right now. So thank you.
Exactly. I wanted to discuss Clark County, as particularly our school-age kids. Right now, Nevada is kind of a leader in American demographic trends. Not quite half of our state is white, without also identifying as Latino, and 29% are of Hispanic heritage. African Americans are 10%, and Asian Americans, who are our fastest growing population in Nevada, are 10% of our people. Additionally, close to 1 in 5 of our children are multiracial or from multiracial families. We have special challenges in bias and racism that extend far beyond Black and white at this point. How do you guys think that this impacts our schools? All right.
Yeah, that's a really big question. So I'm sure every single one of you have an answer on that.
I'll start on that one. So I work at a local high school. Most of my career is school social work in high schools. Really, it's kind of multifaceted, and going back to some of the earlier comments, our education system was already built to educate one group of people, right? It was built not to educate everybody, but to educate a specific group of people. And then over time, we started to expand it a little bit to be more inclusive, but a lot of those foundational things did not develop as fast as the trends of changes of demographics changed. So a lot of times we see things like, let's take history, for example. The history in our schools is still very, very skewed. It is not inclusive of all of our demographics. It's not inclusive of all of our people. And a lot of it isn't always accurate. So you have these students learning one thing at school. A lot of us teach our kids about our culture at home, and that becomes a very, very confusing thing for kids. So at school, I'm learning one thing. At home, I'm learning something completely different, and I don't understand why there's these big discrepancies. And so when we look at bias in our education system, I think we have to look at the curriculum standards and make sure that they are inclusive of all the diversity within our district. We can't keep going with the status quo when the status quo isn't the status quo anymore. As it changes, we must change too, to adapt to our students and our different cultures and our different demographics.
So I'm needing to co-sign because I think often as classroom teachers, particularly if we are early in our career and uncertain about our agency, that we have a responsibility to advocate for all of our children, that we have a responsibility to reach beyond the curriculum, right? The curriculum, as Monique acknowledged, created a certain way, and created for a certain demographic, however that looks, because I acknowledge that there has been some recognition of differentiation. Also can't speak necessarily to whether or not that is equitable, have some very strong opinions about that, but also in acknowledging that advocacy, that we take it upon ourselves to engage in a professional learning that has us take a self-assessment, if you will, around our biases, around our prejudices, around our predispositions, around the assumptions that we make, and then intentionally reach out for what our children need, for what all of our children need. And acknowledging that that seems very daunting, that that's very overwhelming when we have children in our classroom who possibly represent 15, 20 different cultures, possibly 6, 7 languages or more. And yet this is what we lean into. This is why we are in this space, and that we have a responsibility to teach all of those children, to value all of those children, and to teach those children to value one another. That bias will continue to stand if we are not also holding one another responsible as colleagues. Certainly have gotten a little bit of pushback on challenging colleagues around the way that they lean in, but I think that we have that responsibility as well. It makes it challenging, it makes it uncomfortable, but that is what we're going to have to be in order to change the system in the way the system has been designed.
Well, and I wanted to hop in on that because I think you're talking about from the teacher perspective, and I see that so clearly. You know, I remember, gosh, 20 some years ago, my AP US teacher had us read Howard Zinn's History of America. And obviously, you know, that was a eye-opening difference from a lot of the lessons I had learned. But so I 100% agree on the power in curriculum. But I also think that this is where the parent voice and partnership, like, we have to be able to lean back. Like, there has to be that, there doesn't have to be, but I think when it works best is when both as families and as educators, there's a respect to recognize what we don't know. Like, and being willing to say, you know, you and I have had these conversations. I don't understand this, or this is what I think. What do you think? And being willing to recognize that maybe you're going to say something that sounds wrong. And I think right now that's an issue for a lot of white people like myself. Like, people want to be aware and understand, but then they go, what if I say the wrong thing? And so, like, I think that's part of those conversations, like you said, leaning in. Like, we have to be willing as families to meet educators in that space, and also to recognize when we need to change, or also when we need to share our perspective and the situations in our family. Because a lot of people see me as the mom rolling up on the playground and have no idea that all my children are Hispanic. There's that assumption that comes into play. And so I've had educators say things to me that I know they would never ever say had they realized that those were my kids. And they weren't necessarily mean, you know, spitefully, but it was those assumptions. And so there's that interplay of how do we both engage in that. And I also have to talk about the power of curriculum. You know, my kids, they have a teacher that that both my boys have had, that uses literature to highlight history and have those conversations. They did a whole project about oppression in 5th grade. And so now the conversations I can have with my kids about situations that are happening right now are building on things they already learned. And I appreciate the teacher who made that effort to start it in a way that made sense to kids using literature and history. So just wanted to add my, that I've seen how powerful that can be for kids to understand. Juliana, I didn't mean to jump off. Looks like our feed ended. So we may have to stream back. So hang tight just a second. And we were discussing a really big question related to the diversity that exists in Nevada with our large representation of people of color and different ethnicities and races, and the large amount of multiracial children in America, and how does that impact our schools, and how do we respond to it? And Juliana, I think you were waiting patiently as the rest of us talked, so I will let you go.
I learned so much by listening to you all, so I'm very appreciative of that time. Another consideration is in terms of leadership, in terms of educational leadership, what does our percentage of teachers look like? Unfortunately, those demographic changes haven't caused a change in terms of our demographics of teachers. Right now, it's still about 80% white teachers, 20% teachers of color. And I think that's showing, it's symptomatic of the fact that the educational system hasn't done enough to bring people of color into schools. You know, if we look at the history of schooling for different populations, it's been very traumatic. You look at a lot of Native American communities and the history of Indian schools and how traumatic they continue to be, and the impact parents and family members, grandparents continue to have about schooling. You look at the Black community, how often parents are treated. If you look at the Latinx community, similarly, Filipino community, there's patterns that exist that I think that are very evident of the fact that we need that same diversification in the leadership. And that extends to administrative, that extends to our school boards, our state boards, and it's really important. That's one of the steps, right? It's not just because we are in positions where we can mold and shape and be honest and clear about these systematic and systemic issues, because they're both, but that's the first step. The second step is having a community of people that push forward and help amplify these issues. The other thing that I wanted to talk about was, you know, racism is very real in every aspect of our world. And I've seen this idea circulating a lot, the idea that if you're learning about it, what a privilege it is, versus if you've lived with it your whole life, how difficult that is. And I think that everybody has work to do, but particularly non-Black people, Latinx people, Asian American people, white people, we have work to do to be able to push ourselves to make sure that when we talk about race and the racism that impacts the livelihood, the wellness of our Black brothers and sisters, that we are not afraid. If we are uncomfortable, then we're using those emotions to guide us into what we need to be braver and think deeply about. You know, why is it that talking about these issues is political or unacceptable in schools? That in of itself is wrapped with racist tones. You know, I should be able to come into a school and say Black Lives Matter, no matter who I am, and not be considered political or an agitator or somebody who is trying to, you know, use their own bias to influence children. So we're not quite there yet. We need to be there where our communities feel safe and protected in schools. I don't think they do right now. I think that it's explicit work that educators and parents, you know, and families in collaboration need to do. And it's all about relationship building. You know, there's teachers who can build relationships with every single student, every single family. And I guarantee you that those are the teachers who maybe they know it, maybe they don't, but are tearing down those barriers of feeling isolated, feeling unwelcomed at the school. I think that that's where it starts. But it's also, one can't not be done without teachers being very, very intentional about their biases and how their biases, whether they're implicit or explicit, what the impact of those biases are. You have very well-intentioned teachers, but it doesn't matter if you're well-intentioned, if you are excluding community members, if you're re-traumatizing children, if you're not helping. And so I think that that's a difficult question to ask the entire teaching force of our entire country to ask. But I said this in a previous webinar, and I've been thinking about it ever since, and it's a truth that we have to confront. There's folks who, you know, thinking about George Floyd and his murder and his family and how that's impacting his family. There are teachers who would embrace his daughter Gianna as I believe she's a kindergartner, she's 6 years old, as their student, and use asset mindset when they are developing educational systems for her. But there are teachers, those very same teachers, who would not extend that asset mindset to her dad and are not doing it right now. So as an educator, I have to believe that all children in this country are my students, that this is a conversation that needs to be differentiated depending on your population. We have very segregated schools in this country, in the city, which means that kids don't get to build relationships with other kids of other cultures, ethnicities, linguistic abilities. And our stories tie us to our humanity. So we have to be in a place where we're comfortably, in a very everyday way, sharing our stories. You know, that's one of the bright spots of social media, that we get to share our stories and connect with others. But then the other spot is that we realize what the other side looks like. You know, when we engage with folks on social media who aren't kind, who aren't willing to address how racism hurts them as people, because I don't think that, you know, I believe, like what the brain research says, that our brains are malleable. With work, we can change our brains. We can unwire and rewire. And so I think that that's just my call for educators and for families too, you know, especially folks within the PTA who have a lot of leverage and have a lot of know-hows at schools, is how do we share this knowledge? And I just don't mean knowledge of this awakening of racism and the impacts of racism. I'm talking about the everyday, the long-term work on how we counter that through the relationship buildings, through the, you know, dismantling barriers that make certain families feel uncomfortable or unwelcome. And so we got to share that knowledge, and we got to keep the work going and do it with a lot of love, you know, because you're never going to lose anything by connecting with kids and families. We only have beautiful things to gain.
Thank you. And that actually leads really well into the next question. That's kind of a follow-up. Obviously, we're the Parent-Teacher Association. We believe very strongly in family engagement. But a lot of times you hear with family engagement, they aren't interested in being involved, or I don't know how to reach that group or those parents or this family. And that's said by lots of different people in different ways. Whether it's language, race, again, the socioeconomic, as Juliana said, we do have many segregated schools, and not just by race and ethnicity or language, but also socioeconomic, big stratification in certain areas. So how do you think we can, like specifically, what are 2 or 3 things each of you would share of how we can improve family engagement? Because we know research tells us that family engagement is key to improving the educational outcomes for every child. It's a huge boost for kids' performance academically and how they feel about themselves, is that family engagement. So how do you think, with the lens of identifying bias and racism and how to overcome that, how do you think we can, what are actionable things that can be done to improve family engagement? I think, Monique, you answered first last time, so if I can toss it back to you. I know, another big question.
I think that starts with trust. You know, if families do not trust you as an educator and a leader of their children, there will be no engagement. And I think that's the part that gets left by the wayside, so to speak, because if I, as a mother, I come to you and I feel your biases against me, if I hear the microaggressions that you might not realize are harmful that you're saying to me, I'm not going to trust you. And why would I engage with somebody who I cannot trust? And I think that goes back to engaging our families and being culturally competent. We're not expecting you to know everything about every culture and every language, but we're asking you to be open, and we're asking you to be willing to learn just as much as you want us to learn about how your classroom works and how your standards are within a school. So I think that's where a lot of it comes from. I see a lot of parents come into the school, and as soon as they walk through the door, it's like, oh, here's so-and-so's mom, or who's so-and-so's dad, or did you see what she has on, or here we go. You know, those are little things that people easily pick up on. And then we turn around and we say, oh, well, so-and-so's mom never comes to conferences. They never call me back, or they refuse to speak to me. Well, let's talk about why that is. And I'm not here saying that every parent is pleasant, right? Sometimes we do have those difficult conferences where maybe we don't see eye to eye. However, you have to be willing to do the work. And sometimes they think there is some fear in that, fear that you might say the wrong thing, or fear that you might do the wrong thing. And I know, speaking as a minority and as a parent, I am okay if you mess up, if you're still willing to learn. I don't expect you to know every term. I don't expect you to know my individual family needs or background, but I would like for you to be willing to listen to me and hear my concerns, hear my needs, and I can give you the same respect to hear what yours are as well.
Yeah, I think I love the two-way street kind of that you talked about. You know, we have to be willing on both sides. Thank you. Anybody else want to chime in?
I will. I think we need to really be reflective about what we ask families and parents to come engage in on campus. I think that's the question. Often it's limited to parent-teacher conferences that are very top-down. You're receiving information, sometimes not information that you particularly want to hear, you know, because it's information about grades or, you know, discipline issues. I think sometimes if schools have evolved to have family nights and parent nights and things like that, that have made that more comfortable for families, but they still tend to be top down. You're given information, or here's something you need to do. I think before we do those things, we need to, one, do a needs assessment, but first an assets assessment. What is it that the community you teach in, what assets do they have? What strengths do they have? What times for celebration is the school planning for? How are the teachers being, maybe not trained, but how are they collaborating with families to put those events together? So at the school that I used to work at, Crestwood Elementary, we started a garden program, and that was always my underlining intention, was to have a horizontal, meaning no one's telling anybody what they need to do or what they don't know. Everybody's kind of on the same plane, and we're just going to build a garden. And we're going to work in the garden, and we're going to enjoy the harvest together, and we're going to watch our kids do that. And so I think that's where it's at, is really being honest on where we are in family engagement. And then there's this great book called Despite Best Intentions by Amanda Lewis and John B. Diamond. And basically he did this intensive case study of the school that's supposedly like an utopian type school in terms of their demographic. They have like a very diverse population of students in terms of socioeconomic access. There's also a diverse amount of students. The campus itself is very well funded, yet there's all these disparities, and they're beyond everyone's good intentions. So what happened? Why did these disparities occur? And one of the things that I love about this case study is that he went and asked the families. He asked the students, you know, and they were all able to tell him and his co-author where all of these inequities lied. And it was very obvious, and everybody was very surprised about how obvious it was. But I think that that's where we start. We start by asking our community, what is it that you would like to do with the school? Sometimes having a slight plan is easier, especially for some of the families that might be more shy or might not see themselves as people who have a lot to contribute. But when the school acknowledges that and embraces that, beautiful things happen, because these relationships grow, where parents are comfortable, they're themselves, and there's autonomy. And I think that that's really, really important for teachers to understand how their behavior can really open those doors. And then you build from there. You know, maybe for a long time, it's just these very informal get to know you type of activities or spaces. where, you know, if there's a linguistic barrier between the families, then, you know, there's support for that. If there's timing issues, I know that a lot of, especially in Las Vegas, work schedules are very difficult for a lot of families to be able to come in and participate in schools. So I think it's just about being creative about how you get over those barriers, and make sure that families have welcoming spaces to continue to participate.
Thank you. Tanya, did you want to add anything?
I do. I was very excited to hear the question. Definitely gives me an opportunity to reminisce and to embrace relationships that I continue to have. I say that relationships matter. I say that it's important to build those relationships very intentionally, not only with children, but with families, recognizing that children do not come to you as individuals unattached to a community, to a family, to an ecosystem. It reminded me of the commitment that that we have to be passionate about as educators, but also as family members. I acknowledge, right, that there is exactly what you said, that balance. And yet, as an educator, I feel wholly responsible for being the one to initiate that. I would tell my families at the beginning of every year, we're raising children together. We either will do that for 1 year or we will do that for 12 years. And so I have gone to the graduations of children who were 3 and 4 and 5 inside of my classroom and seen them walk around, you know, across a high school age, because we built relationships that mattered, that we're part of the community. You're not a drive in and drive out. It isn't a 9 to 5. I don't know if that comes as a surprise to anyone, right? My holidays don't belong to me. My families are my families. I have often been at dinner on Thanksgiving and gone over to visit a family on Christmas morning because they are my family. We built relationships with one another, and those matter. And everything that everyone has said is built upon relationships. It is when you have relationships that you can have conversations, that you can have difficult conversations, that you can celebrate, that you can plan, that you can, what is to be, what do you want for the children together. Often I think that teachers may lean in thinking, I need to send home a survey or a questionnaire. That is not the lean in that I'm talking about. I'm talking about seeing people for who they are, appreciating them for who they are, leaning into exactly what Juliana said, right? Their assets, but their worth. Your worth because you exist, not because of where you live, not because of the school you go to, not because you're my student. To Juliana's point, that all of the children are ours. We have a responsibility for all of the children. And as adults, we have responsibilities to one another. I think that became even more clear to me as I was outside of the classroom and had an opportunity to travel to Kenya and recognize our responsibility is not solely to the children who are in front of us that we see, that we touch, that we hug, that we teach, but all children. And so in dismantling that hierarchy that exists, that we created, because we are all part of the system and responsible either for upholding that system or changing it. But it all to me comes back to relationships and valuing one another.
Thank you. I know Kali has a question to ask, but you know, Juliana touched on asset-based mindset, and I love that, and I think that's something we all need to remember. But I think, Tanya, you taught me a term that I frequently use and people go, what's that? And that's deficit model family engagement. And I think that that's something that we all need to be really conscious of, because I think that it overlaps so frequently with our biases, where we come from a family engagement perspective of, you don't know, so I'm going to tell you. I'm going to, and without recognizing that frequently our assumptions may not be correct in that. And so that family engagement needs to recognize the worth that everybody brings to the table, even if it looks different than what we anticipate it to look like. So thank you all for those comments. And we are really close on time. Does everybody have time for one more question? Okay.
So I'm actually going to go a little bit off script because something just occurred to me as you ladies were speaking. And it is, how do we bring children back into our school communities when they have been the victims of racial bias, either verbally or physically? How do we make them comfortable again and open them back up to trust our system of education?
I don't want to jump on anyone's opportunity, and I will be brief because I recognize the time as well. I immediately go to thinking about certainly challenges that I have had as a student inside of the school system, and the experience that I've had. I've thought about the experiences that my daughter's had. I think about my exchange student who came over and was Nigerian and Turkish and the experiences he had, and how as a parent I needed to advocate, and how as an educator I also advocate, but help my parents learn to advocate as well, and how we learn to heal. There's no easy answer to this, and yet I want to acknowledge that the state has passed legislation which allows us now to consider restorative justice practices, and how we do not simply set aside children, but how everyone comes back to that space around the concept of worth and belonging. It is not going to be an easy undertaking. It is something definitely that is going to take time. But again, we're challenged to look at our biases and to be able to embrace one another for the individuals that we are. It feels so forced. My apologies. I feel like I'm running against the clock. Monique, it looked as though you wanted to lean in, and I want to make sure you have an opportunity to do that.
Thank you. I really just wanted to say that we first have to acknowledge there's a problem. I think a big issue and what's kind of come to the surface now is a lot of minorities have said, hey, we have this huge problem, guys. Hey, listen to us. And a lot of people have been like, oh, that's not that really big of a problem, or it doesn't affect me, so I'm not necessarily going to invest my time into it, or, well, that's just your experience. That doesn't mean that's everybody's. And we've really downplayed a lot of the experiences that people have been telling us for a long time have been happening. And so I think the first step is acknowledging that there's a problem, right? That's the first step of recovery, right? You have to acknowledge there's a problem, right? And right now, we have to recover. As a country, as a world, we have to start healing. And in order to start that healing process, we have to say, okay, we acknowledge that there is some systematic racism built into the framework of our educational institutions. Okay, now that we've acknowledged it, right? Now we can start having conversations about what it looks like to help reframe or deconstruct, reconstruct, whatever that looks like. But a lot of times the kids come back and they say, hey, I'm telling you there's a problem, and they don't feel heard. You know, as a social worker, I get those kids all day, every day. They're like, hey, Ms., I've talked to my teacher, I've talked to admin, I've talked to all these people, and nobody will listen to me. And sometimes that's all it takes, is for you to just sit with a kid and say, I'm listening. Let's hear it. And when they're done, they're like, okay, I feel so much better. Now I can help you fix it, right? Because what we know about mental health is that if somebody is not emotionally regulated, they don't hear anything you have to say. Nothing. And we see this in the classroom all the time, right? A kid escalates, and then we escalate back, and then it turns into this huge mess, right? And then they go into the admin office, and the admin lectures them, and the next day they're doing the same thing, and we're scratching our heads like, I don't understand why this keeps happening. Well, we have to get these kids to a regulatory state first in order to get our message even across to where they can receive it. So again, I think it starts with acknowledgement, listening to what these kids have to say, and then being able to get them into a level-headed space to be able to receive whatever it is that you want to convey.
I just want to acknowledge, as Monique says, that we have to believe that they deserve to be heard. we have to believe that their words matter and that they have worth. And I believe if we don't embrace that, even if we listen, we may not really hear them.
Yeah. We are out of time, which I wish we had more time, but that's part of what I wanted to say. So Nevada PTA is doing these town halls bi-weekly on a number of different topics. And my commitment is that this won't be the end of this discussion, because I think that's, as Monique, you were speaking, I feel like that is where, as a society, we so frequently get stuck. We do something to feel like we've fixed it and then just keep moving on when we all know we haven't addressed it. We all know it's still a problem, but we feel like we did some token thing and now it's better. And I think some of that's well-intentioned, but obviously, if we look around right now, it hasn't worked and we have to do better. And so there's obviously, it's not a one thing, but I hope that you or others will come back and join us again for continuing conversations about how we can move the discussion forward. I think it's in each of our parts of the world, you know, our spheres that we live in, we can do our part. So I have learned so much from so many comments tonight, and I appreciate you guys joining us and taking the time. We will be following up with a post probably tomorrow at this point about resources such as the Sesame Street Town Hall that Monique talked about. We had already shared it, but we're going to kind of put it all together in one place. And so that way everybody can come back and look at that. And the panelists, if you have thought of anything else that you want to add to it, feel free to send us those resources, because we want to be able to share out and help educators and families as they look inward and then decide how to move forward, have those resources available. So thank you for joining us. Khalid, did you want to say anything before we sign off?
No, just thank you everyone for your participation. This has been an amazing town hall.
So thank you again for joining us, and we hope to continue the discussion on another night.
Thank you.
Thank
Good
you.
night, everybody.
Have a great night.